Well, hello everyone. Nice to almost said see you all. I can't see you, but it's very nice to see that there are people coming in. I can see that in the participant list here, and I'm very pleased to see that you take your time in this beautiful day. Now I see the fog is coming in, but still it's a nice summer day. So I guess many of you have chosen to log on to MCCF's Lunch and Learn instead of spending your time out in the sun, which is nice. But we'll spend an hour or so together here where I'll talk a little bit about my research, what I've been doing in Stonington and Deer Isle for a while, and how what I've done is actually very closely connected to what I've done in my previous research in the Philippines. So first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Jon Remme, as I'm called here. My full name is Jon Henrik Ziegler Remme. I'm associate professor in social anthropology at the University of Bergen in Norway. And I've been here in Stonington and Deer Isle for about 6 months now, came here in January, and have been very generously hosted by Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries for this period, and also by Dartmouth College. So I just wanted to, first of all, say thanks so much to MCCF for having me here, for helping me out, for making sure that I got in touch with people and basically helped me along the way, both me and my family who are here with me. And also wanted to say thanks to all the people I've talked to, all the fishermen, all the lobstermen, and everyone else that I've been in touch with. It can be a bit intimidating to come to a place and try to be part of the community, to try to get to know as many people as possible, and often ask quite, let's say, curious questions to people about stuff that I often take for granted. But most people, or everyone, has been very, very welcoming, and I'm very, very happy with my stay here. So, as many of you saw in the abstract for this talk, I asked there what makes an anthropologist who has done research in the Philippines about something seemingly completely different come to a place like Stonington, Maine. And of course, these days it's not that curious because it's a very, very nice place. There's a lot of people coming here, of course. But I came in January when it was not that pleasant in a way. It's cold and wet and everything. Quite common for climate for me as a Norwegian, of course, but still not a place where a lot of people come to in wintertime. And curious enough, one of the reasons behind me coming at that time is the fact that I was interested in studying time and how time and people's experience of time, of seasons, on the rhythms of nature, to put it that way, how time and people's relations with nature and particularly marine life is very, very closely connected. And coming to Stonington at a time where the season is pretty much on its low, both tourist season and fishing season, was very, very interesting. And it's been a way of staying here for a while to see how that changes and how kind of life here changes with what's going on in the sea outside of here. So I thought I would talk a little bit about what my interests are as a researcher and how that has kind of been emerged from my research in the Philippines, and how that has kind of opened up questions I'm interested in following up on here in Stonington. So first of all, let me say a little bit about what anthropology is as a discipline. I guess some of you might know a bit what it is, and some of you might not. So I thought maybe which is, I should tell you a little bit about, if I can get this to work, what social and cultural anthropology is really about. So traditionally, anthropology is seen as a study of human communities and cultures, how societies operate, how they work, and how people think about their lives. And we are generally interested in studying people's own experience of the world they're living. So we tend to try to get at the kind of what's called the native point of view, which is basically an aiming to understand how people think and how people live and how they understand how their world works. And it is a discipline that is comparative, which means that we try to kind of compare different societies and different cultures, not necessarily putting them up against each other and see similarities and differences, and not at all trying to see if something works better than other places, but more a way of seeing things in perspective and trying to see how one culture, things that are going on there, kind of opens up things that we don't necessarily think about in other societies. So it's a way of kind of to relativize things, and often to relativize things that we usually take for granted. So that is one kind of characteristic of social anthropology. Another thing is what is called holism, and that is we are interested in seeing how social processes are interconnected. So basically, the idea is that you cannot really study only the economic side of a society. You also need to understand how all of these economy, politics, and everything are interconnected. So that is another part of what anthropology is. And to me, anthropology is very much an empirical discipline, in the sense that we study like quite abstract and philosophical questions, perhaps, but we are interested in how those questions register in actual people's lived lives. So how it actually kind of is part of their life and shaping their lives. So that is what I'm interested in doing, and in my research on time and temporality. Now, as I said, traditionally anthropology is a study of human communities and cultures, but the part of anthropology that I'm doing my research within is called multispecies anthropology. And traditionally in anthropology, while we tended to study like human communities, there were some interested in animals and plants and stuff like that, but then mainly how humans kind of managed nature, how you managed fish, for instance. In multispecies anthropology, we are more interested in how people and other like animals, plants, materials, what we call non-humans, kind of coexist and shape each other's life. So it's not just humans kind of being in charge of nature, but also how humans or non-humans kind of influence the processes that goes on in societies. So basically our methods we use is what's called participant observation. So we go into societies, settle down there, stay there for an extended period of time, and both observe what people are doing and also participate in their lives and their working lives and everyday lives. So here in the picture, for instance, you can see me planting rice in the Philippines. So it's basically a way of studying social processes by being part of them. And that is supplemented by talking to people, both more informally through conversations, but also through interviews. But the basic idea here is that there are actually some things that you cannot really just access through interviews. I mean, you could talk to people, but basically you won't get at like a full understanding of society and social processes if you just talk to people about them. And interviews is like a very specific way of talking to people which can elicit some information, but not everything. So that's why we kind of come to places and settle down there. And that's why I came to Stonington, in order to just not come here just to do a few interviews and that's that, but actually to live here and be part of the community as much as possible. So this is what I've been doing earlier in the Philippines. And a lot of the stuff I did there, as I will talk about now, kind of inspired a lot of interest and questions that I took with me to my research here in Stonington. So Ifugao is indigenous people who live in the northern part of the Philippines, up in the highlands. So as you can see on the picture here, they live in like these small villages situated in steep mountains, mostly forest-covered mountains, but a lot of these mountains have been carved out into rice terraces. These terraces are on the World Heritage List. They cultivate wet rice in these terraces, and in some of the steep forest sides you can see here on the right hand and left hand side of the picture are actually gardens where they cultivate potatoes and tubers and vegetables, basically. And they also have a lot of chickens and pigs. So like every household have a few chickens, provides eggs, of course, but also other important roles in this society, as I will tell you. So most of the rice they cultivate is for consumption, of course, for eating, but also for producing a very important ritual ingredients, that is rice wine. But the chicken and pigs are what actually interests me a lot in this society, because a lot of the life in these villages kind of revolve around pigs. They are very important as a way of of building relations with each other. And it's a way, when you kill a pig, you basically need to share meat. And that's how you show that you are related to people. But the pigs have also a very other important role in this society. And that is that it is the primary way of getting in touch with and cultivating relations with spirits and ancestors. Because this area here, this village here, is located, it's inhabited by, let's say, around 1,000 inhabitants. But there are thousands and thousands of other kind of invisible beings that these people actually engage with, that are deities and spirits, as you can see some statues of here, but also ancestors. So basically, when people die in this community, people think that the spirits of the dead go to kind of continue to live on for quite some time. And they need to engage with relations with these ancestors, both ancestors and spirits of different kinds that kind of inhabit the landscape around them in different ways. And they do that by different ways. Some of these is by ensuring that they cultivate rice according to how it was traditionally done. And there are kind of strict regulations about how you cultivate rice that are told to people in kind of oral mythical rituals. And if a stone wall like this is destroyed from rain, for instance, it needs to be rebuilt in a particular way in order for the spirits to be satisfied. So like the everyday working life of people, they are rice farmers primarily, is very much shaped by the ways that the spirits and ancestors kind of decided that this should be done. So this is very much a cultural heritage, where the past, in many senses, shapes very much the way everyday life today is actually done. And if you don't do it according to the tradition, you can actually be ill, or some people even died. That's their understanding of how this how this culture works. So one of my informants, for instance, he didn't rebuild his stone wall after it was ruined by rain, and instead chose to go up to a place where there's a lot of tourists in order to be taken picture of and earning money in that way, and not working according to the kind of rules of the ancestors. And when he got ill and died, people kind of argued that it was because he didn't follow the traditions and didn't follow the regulations by the ancestors. So the shapes, the past very much shapes how everyday life there works. So showing respect for tradition is basically a very, very important way of ensuring that the relations with spirits are in order. But that is just one way of doing it, because sometimes you get ill, sometimes people get harvests that are not as good as expected. And the main explanation for that is that must be caused by some sort of disorder in relations between living humans and ancestors. And in order to kind of change that, in order to heal people or to make sure that harvests are better in the future, people organize and arrange ritual sacrifices where they sacrifice pigs, basically, to the ancestors. And that is a way of making sure that one's future becomes different than what it could be. So if you wouldn't do a ritual like that, it would actually kind of change the whole future, and you would probably die or have harvest that you couldn't live off. So rituals were a way of making sure that of changing the future of an individual or even a community. So it was a sort of a temporal intervention through an animal sacrifice. What it did was basically to invite, if you were ill or having problems with harvest, you would invite some ritual experts like these. They would come to your house and they would sit there and invite the spirits and ancestors to actually come and be present in the house. It was a way of kind of bringing the past, the mythical figures, the ancestors into the present and making them approachable, making it possible to actually talk to them and give them stuff. And what they would do was to sacrifice chickens like this, and they would open them up and look at the bile sac of the chicken to see if the spirits would accept the gifts that we're giving them. So chickens were just not only kind of meat, it was a way of a medium of communication with the spirits. The ritual experts would become possessed by the spirits, so people could talk to them, they could see them dance and be present there outside the house. And they would eventually move the whole thing over to the pigs that lie there in the yard in order for them to be sacrificed. So you can see here that the chicken, the rooster, is put on the pig, and kind of goes to show that the relations between humans and spirits and between the present and the past, to a large extent, was done through animals. and they would also play gongs and create a lot of music. And you can see these gongs here. They have handles made. One of them is made out of a human jawbone, which is a kind of a relic from the time when these people were headhunters, where there were a lot of wars going on between tribes and villages, and people would take other people's head and would kind of bring the head back to the village. And so the present, that kind of that history is part of these rituals to a very large extent still. They will singe the pigs in order to get the smoke and the smell of these pigs to go to the spirits, because in these rituals it is the soul of the pig that actually goes to the spirit. The meat is actually divided into specific pieces. Some of them are served people coming to the ritual, and some, like these on the left-hand side of the screen, are given to the relatives of the family arranging the rituals. So that was a way of showing that you are actually kin related. So it's although everyone here are using a kinship system where you are basically related through blood, as we also think about kinship here. You weren't actually really in kin relations with each other if you didn't exchange meat with each other. So pig meat was very, very important to enact kin relations. The pigs were also important for social status, because the number of pigs that people sacrifice at rituals is a way of showing social status and gaining prestige. So if you could afford to sacrifice a lot of pigs, then you would be acknowledged as a very kind of high class individual in that society. Now, another thing that I studied in this society was the conversion to Pentecostal Christianity. So there were mainly in the village where I lived, people were Catholics, but they were also combining that with that kind of animistic type of traditional religion where they engaged in relations with spirits and ancestors. But some of them were converting to a Protestant form of Christianity that to a large extent saw spirits and ancestors as representatives of the devil, Satan. And that created a lot of challenges to them, because that changed very much how they related to pigs, for instance. So many of these Pentecostals couldn't receive meat from sacrificed pigs. So it's kind of created a lot of implications for how kinship were actually enacted in this society. Another thing was that they refrained from following the synchronization rules for planting rice. Now, in the rice cultivation system as this, synchronization of when the different fields are planted was very, very important, because if they didn't follow that, you would have different fields becoming mature in at different times. So birds, rats, insects could go from one field to another and actually ruin it and eat up all the rice. So there was an agricultural leader in this village, sort of a chief, that made sure that all the rice cultivation followed a kind of a system where they made sure that all the fields were planted at the same time. Pentecostals wouldn't like to do that because they saw that the chief as too closely associated with what they saw as the demonic spirits. So they started to plant on different times, and it created a lot of problems, obviously. So basically, what I was interested here was to look at the kind of multi-species temporal politics that converting to Pentecostalism actually entailed. So time and timing of when things was done was a religious issue, of course, but it was also very much a political issue. And it was all about the politics of timing of when things should be done and when people's engagement with plants and animals actually should occur. So that was a way of kind of politicizing time in a way that I found very, very interesting. Now, what I'm telling you now is just a brief thing of what I'm doing in my research in the Philippines. But I've written books about this, as you can see here, about the role of pigs in these societies, which is a very, very, very important part of society. And society there is very, very much shaped by this kind of triangular relation between humans, animals, and spirits. So that's what a lot of my research has been about. And as I've kind of hinted to, there are some things that occurred in my research there that made me think about how time actually kind of emerged from these relations, and how people's experience of the past and what role the past plays in the present, how futures are tried, or how people try to intervene in human, animal, spirit relations in order to kind of shape futures. So there are questions that kind of interest me a lot. And that kind of draw me to thinking kind of philosophically about time. That is much more than how we kind of used to think about time as a thing that just goes on in and of itself, and it kind of divided into 60 minutes and years and months, etc. So basically thinking about time as much more than what is kind of measured by the clock, but thinking about time as actually emerging from these relational practices for how people engage with and live with animal life in a way. So it is a research that is interested in how time is experienced, how time is in many senses multiple, but there's not just one time in a way. There are many, many different times involved on different scales, of different speeds, and times sometimes become intertwined. And we can think about it as a form of polyrhythm that is not always in sync with each other, and some of these rhythms and times can be compatible, but also very much in conflict with each other. And also thinking about time as actually subject to change, as what people actually do is to try to kind of slow down or speed up time. Like conservation practices are, in many senses, a way of trying to kind of slow down change, or kind of prolonging something over time. And it can also be about ending something, basically a way of tricking with temporal processes. And there's also this issue that I mentioned towards the end there, that all these kind of time processes are actually very much kind of political issues. So a lot of the political conflicts around human-animal relations are often actually about time, and different understandings of time, different understandings of what past and is and what future should be. Those kind of philosophical questions are the inspiration to coming out of my research in the Philippines, that very much shaped what I was interested in looking at here in Stonington. And this is part of a larger research project that I'm doing now, and I'm leading, called SEATIMES, How Climate Change Transforms Human Marine Temporalities. So basically, we are a group of 3 researchers, 2 grad students and I, who were interested in how the changes that are going on in marine ecologies all over the world, basically, how that kind of changes the societies where people are very, very much kind of entangled with marine life. So basically, there is this global warming of the waters all over the world. In Atlantic these days, we're seeing like a massive warming of the seas. And of course, the Gulf of Maine is one of the areas in the world where the water temperature actually rises most rapidly. So there are a lot of implications of that, but one of the things that we see is that the kind of migration patterns and the rhythms of life in the sea changes with the warming of the seas. So that is something that we were interested in doing research on. So we have my project here in Maine, and I have 2 grad students doing research on artisanal fishing in Senegal, and another one doing research on whale watching in northern Norway and also in the Azores in Portugal. So it's basically a comparative project where we try to look at the implications of climate change for how people think about the past and the future, so what you call temporal orientations, how people try to intervene in these changing processes through what we call temporal practices, and also about how these changes are related to what we call multi-species rhythms. So we try to study kind of how people live with marine life and how that is kind of shaped by the rhythms of what's going on in human societies, but also what's going on in marine ecosystems. So these kind of 3 overarching themes have been shaping what I've been interested in doing here in Maine. So like when it comes to temporal orientations, for instance, I've been interested in looking at different ideas about past, different understanding of the present situation that these communities are in, and also different understandings of what the future would and can look like. So for instance, one theme that kind of pops up in a lot of the discussions I've had with people here is the importance of generations. And generations, the idea of thinking about, for instance, lobster fishing as cultural heritage, that's something that has been going on for generations, is of course a way of making that connection between what's going on here today and a past, and also about thinking about the future. But generation, of course, is not only limited to human generations. A lot of the things that's going on here in the fisheries is also about, for instance, lobster generations, in trying to kind of restore and sustain the lobster stock. So that concept of generations is something that kind of interests me a lot, because it is something that kind of draws connection between past, present, and future, which is also the same thing we can argue for the concept of heritage, for instance. And a lot of these kind of ideas about and thinking about temporal orientations, past, present, and futures, is also very much kind of related to multi-species rhythms and also multi-species politics. So there is this, of course, this ongoing issue with whale entanglement and whale regulations and all that, the kind of whole conflict around that, which is very much, as I see it, a form of multi-species politics that is about thinking about and having conflicts over different ideas of what a future fishery should look like. And just to make it clear, I have no, I don't take side on any of these issues. I'm just kind of interested in how all these things actually play out and how concepts like generations and heritage actually kind of emerge in those disputes. So another thing that I'm interested in is how these ideas about past, present, and different kinds of future, in a way, how they actually register in people's lives. And that's kind of connected to the point I made earlier about anthropology being a kind of empirical science that is trying to see how philosophical questions actually register in people's lives. And they can do that in many different ways, of course. So one way of doing that, or studying that, is to studying it through what's called affects. I mean, people's kind of affective experience of past, present, and futures. So that can be in terms of fear, of hope, but also optimism and different kinds of other forms of kind of feelings that actually is very, very much part of multi-species politics. So that is a way of studying kind of political processes, one might say, that's not necessarily only focusing on policies and regulations and that kind of more formalized political processes, but actually studying how those kind of politics are experienced by people. And that, I think, is a very, very important part of politics, by the way. There's much more affect politics than what actually often is acknowledged. But another way of studying how these ideas about the future and how conflicts about future, for instance, and multi-species future is registered is through materials. So fishing gear is something I find extremely interesting. And a lot of the work that is being done by lobstermen, by sternmen, by everyone involved in this is so much to do with the actual fishing gear. Of course, obviously, they work with the animals themselves, but a lot of it is kind of through fishing gear. And I guess you all know that fishing gear is, I mean, it's infused with politics. And it's also infused with kind of social dimensions that are very, very important. So like the whole practice of rope cutting and all that kind of stuff that goes on in kind of territorial, defending territories and all that kind of stuff. And also the affects that people actually have towards rope, and the idea that it can be extremely dangerous, for instance, but it's also of great use, of course, to them. So ropes and fishing gear is much, much more, in my sense, much more than a technology. There's so many interesting social and affective dimensions to fishing ropes, for instance, that I think the whole idea of ropeless fishing actually kind of taps into a very, very kind of intimate and central part of what fishing actually involves. So regulating fishing gear is much more than only technology, to put it that way. And also, of course, fishing practices is a way in which ideas about the future is actually kind of enacted in kind of practical work. The actual act of kind of throwing out and measuring and throwing out and V-notching and all that stuff that lobstermen do with lobsters is, of course, a way of kind of putting into practice an idea of a generational form of future for fishermen, but also for lobsters, of course. And what is interesting about all of these temporal orientations is that they are so kind of, let's say, politicized. So there are multiple understandings of these different futures, for instance, involved. Talking to the lobsterman is one, you get one understanding of that. Of course, talking to other ones involved in a whale issue, you get a total different understanding of what a multi-species future in the Gulf of Maine would actually look like. And there's this politics around kind of visibilizing and invisibilizing certain pasts, for instance. So let's say the fact that the cod population disappeared in a way, the whole kind of industrialized form of fishery. What role does that actually play in the idea of sustainability with regards to lobster fishery is something that is very interesting, because it's full of politics around visibilizing and some parts of the history and invisibilizing other parts of the history, which is a very, very interesting thing to study when it comes to temporal orientations. So another part of my research is about temporal practices, what people actually do in order to kind of intervene in temporal processes in many ways. So I've been very, very intrigued by and fascinated by the efforts of restoring river connectivity and the alewife population in this area. And there's a lot of stuff going on there that I find extremely interesting with as a way of trying to kind of cultivate a new form, or not even new, but a kind of a restoration of a past form of human animal connection in a way. And with regards to generation, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's very, very fascinating that a lot of the work that's actually going on now is actually about trying to kind of cultivate that connectivity between humans and alewife with children and school kids of today, in order to kind of regenerate those forms of connections. It's a way of kind of creating a form of awareness of a future connection between humans and alewife, for instance. Another thing that is very, very fascinating with this is that lobster fishery is often presented as, it is an economic activity, surely. It's a fishing activity that is very much about earning money, of course, but it also is a way of life, which is basically, I think, partly why it's also so kind of threatening with the whale regulations and the potential threat that actually that poses, obviously to like this fishing as an economic activity, but also because it is a way of life. And I've been thinking a lot about that, what that actually entails. And it is, of course, a way of life for humans, but it also may be possible to think about it as a way of lives in plural, because that fishing way of life is very much a way of being kind of intertwined with non-human life, like lobster life, and the kind of rhythms of that in many senses. So lobster fishing is, to me, very much a kind of a temporal practice, as I will mention in a few minutes also. Now, lobster pounding and the development of more kind of industrialized and controlled environments of holding tanks is also something I find extremely interesting, because lobster pounding is, in many senses, again, it's an economic activity, but it's also a very, very important kind of temporal activity in which you kind of slow down or speed up or kind of control the biological processes that goes on in lobsters, feeding them and making sure that they are growing, for instance, or in holding tanks with different, where some tanks have different water temperatures in order to kind of slow down the metabolic processes of lobsters. So there are ways in which the lobster industry kind of engages quite intimately with the biological processes of the lobsters, and a lot of this is also kind of tied to a more kind of cultural heritage of pounding as a cultural heritage of the lobster industry in Maine, which is about to transform into kind of more industrial and holding tanks, which that process I find very, very interesting. Now, briefly towards the end, multispecies rhythms is also one of the overarching themes, as I've said, and a lot of what I've said earlier is very much about that. And I've been interested in how life here is kind of attached to the kind of seasonality and what's called phenology, which is like basically the kind of how biological processes of animals, for instance, kind of evolve over time, and how that is kind of related to the shedding and migration of lobsters coming here and going. So I'm trying to kind of think about lobster fishery, for instance, as not only about place. There's a lot of interesting stuff about territoriality, and a lot of it has been written about that earlier, and that obviously is a very, very important thing. But what strikes me is a lot of the fishery is just as much about time and timing. So for me, having a research project on time and temporality, fishing as a kind of temporal practice is also a very, very interesting stuff. And looking at how kind of fisheries try to kind of coordinate with the lobster's movement, and how a lot of it is about fishing at the right time in a way. And also in aquaculture, and also in lobster fishing, how all these activities is very much a kind of a negotiation between different forms of temporalities. So you have to engage with lobsters, of course, but doing aquaculture with oysters and everything else. And, I mean, there's a lot of different forms of animal life in the sea that are interconnected in a way, but which also are changed with climate change and warming waters. So, for instance, the fact that there is an ongoing, seemingly an ongoing mismatch between the rhythms of plankton, zooplankton, and lobster fries, for instance, is a very, very important and an interesting phenomenon, because it's a way, it is one example of how human and lobster life is intertwined with another form of rhythm that kind of becomes out of sync in a way due to climate change, basically. But also all these other qualities of water and materialities like plastics and alternative gear, and market dynamics, what's going on in the seasonality in Canadian fisheries, for instance, and in the consumption market in Asia. So all the different kind of scales with different rhythms and different speeds and tempos kind of come together in the lobster fishery, and kind of shapes that to a large extent. And of course, all these things are at the same time very, very politicized. So it is part of politics with whales, for instance, but also, of course, with offshore wind farming, which has its own idea of a certain sustainable future, for instance, which is kind of a conflict with another understanding of what sustainability actually is in the lobster fisheries. So this is just a kind of a very, very brief overview of how my research and how the questions that I've been interested here in Stonington kind of evolved from my research in the Philippines. And there's much more to it, of course, and I know that the research I've done here, I've been here 6 months now, I've come to a point where you kind of realize that there's so much here that I'd love to be here for another year almost, and we'll probably come back many times to do probably shorter kind of follow-up research, because it needs to, because all of these things kind of evolve over time, and seasonal changes are, of course, a very, very important part of that. So seeing that throughout the year and seeing that over time is very, very important. So yeah, I think I'll probably going to end here and put up my contact details for those of you who are interested in getting in touch with me. Feel free to email me. I will still be in Stonington for a week or so. So if you see me, you can just say hello. But I'm very, very happy to engage with everyone over email and other channels. And of course, now I think we have time for some Q&A. I don't know if there are anyone here who can facilitate that, or maybe you can write your questions in the chat. I don't know if you can get access to that. So we have one question here. Stu C, go ahead. Nice to see you. I need a haircut soon.
Yes, hi. I wondered about your work. I was very, very interested in what you do as an anthropologist. And this is the question that I have for you.
Yep.
What has been your very best day as an anthropologist? And what would be a worst day as an anthropologist? And what do you do to get through that worst day?
Oh, good question. The best day, I would say, is a day when you go out and meet people, talk to people, do stuff with people. So obviously going out fishing has been a very, very good day for me often, because it allows me to observe how things are done. It allows me to talk to people. Well, not that much talking going on often at fishing boats, because you're pretty much busy, but you can talk on the way out and in. So that's a good day. But also other good days as an anthropologist can be to just walk around and observe what's going on. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to kind of participate in stuff, because as an anthropologist, you would like to do both participation and observation. So you need that kind of intimacy or being part of stuff, but you also need that kind of distance. So those are those can be good days in different ways. So talking to people is obviously a very, very important part of what we do. And of course, writing field notes, which we do. So we talk to people, do interviews or participate in stuff. And then I write field notes. And that is can be quite boring in a way, because you have to sit down and write a lot of stuff. But that is also a way of kind of reflecting on what you actually have seen and observed. So a worst day is perhaps a day when it's nothing happening in a way, where you try to get in touch with people and they're hard to get in touch with, or nothing is happening. But I mean, it can be also be a bit difficult to say that a day when nothing happens is a poor day, because that is also part of the community in a way. I've done it a lot in the Philippines. I remember I was quite frustrated when there had nothing going on. But that is part of what life is like there, and also here, of course. So I'd say I must say that as an anthropologist working at the university department, where I also have some commitments for meetings and stuff like that, that is the worst days, because then I have to kind of extract myself from life here in Stonington and do stuff related to meetings and stuff back home. So that's the worst days.
And how do you make it through then? When you have a bad day, why don't you just quit and say, I'm done with this. I'm not going to be an anthropologist anymore.
Well, first of all, I can't, because it's my job in a way. So, but yeah, no, I think, well, it comes a bit with experience. So I actually had those feelings when I did my early on in my fieldwork in the Philippines. I had a lot of feelings about that. I'm not fit for this. It's hard. I mean, it can be quite hard to just kind of approach total strangers and ask them strange, curious questions. It can be a bit intimidating. And so to get through those days, now I know that there are a lot of those days that nothing happening. It can be difficult, and it can be intimidating, but I know from experience that that is part of it. So yeah, basically, fortunately I have my family with me here that kind of keeps my foot on the ground in a way. So I mean, to them, and it is a way, being with them is also a way of kind of coming through that and teaching me that there's more to life than academic work in a way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susie. Good question. Let's see. I have a few hands here as well. David Porter. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. I'm calling to ask if you've been looking at the implications, multi-species and anthropological implications of rockweed harvesting, the intertidal seaweed. That's the forest that is a nursery bed for so many of the marine creatures. No, I haven't, but I'm aware of it. And it is something that I began looking into a little bit, trying to get to meet people who are involved in the seaweed harvesting industry, but it came to a point where I hadn't the chance to do it. I hadn't time to do it, but it's definitely on my list of things to follow up, and I would be very, very interested in getting inputs on that, because I know it's a very, very important part of it. And it's, again, it's one of those industries that invites, very kind of easily is presented as a kind of, in one way, a green, sustainable form of harvesting, but it kind of has a lot of other ways of doing it that are not that sustainable, I guess. And then the implications of it are, I think, very, very crucial to understand. That goes for basically everything that goes on in the sea, that I would like to see more understandings of connectivities and what the different things that people do with life in the sea are actually interconnected, and what implication that actually have. Yeah, I think that's important. What you're saying is the interconnectivity of that potential harvest. It's very different from the aquaculture, kelp farming and things like that, because it's an intertidal forest, and it's connected with the animals and the fishes, and it's connected with the lives of fisher people that are involved with it as well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I've been reading a bit about the implications of the sea urchin harvesting and how that affected seaweed and seaweed growth in the Gulf of Maine, which is also a very, very important thing. And then basically how the overfishing, or at least very hard fishing of sea urchins, actually kind of promoted the growth of seaweed, which is very kind of beneficial to lobsters and stuff like that. And those again are kind of associated with consumption demands in Asia and stuff like that. So it's very kind of global issue that kind of has very local consequences. Yeah.
Those were the subtidal seaweeds. The rockweed is an intertidal species, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thanks a lot. Let's see. What more? Barbara Kent Lawrence raised her hand.
Hi there. The first thing, I have a couple of questions, but I have to point out that I'm probably the only other person on the in this group that's eaten roasted pig in the Philippines.
Oh, good. Yes, we know how good it is.
It was back in 1956, so we could compare. A couple of things. The first thing struck me is that your interest in cultural perceptions of time reminds me of Edward Hall's work, and I wondered if you see any similarities, or if you have ever looked at his work.
Edward Hall.
Edward Hall. He wrote the popular book. I used to use it when I was teaching, called The Hidden Dimension. And it's very much about cultural ways of molding space, defining space, and it just seemed to connect.
Okay.
Do you ever?
No.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that book I don't know actually. So that's a very, very good tip.
Okay.
A lot of my inspiration for this work comes from, like theoretically, from Anat Singh, and also Lefebvre, which is a French philosopher.
Yes.
Who's wrote a book called Rhythm Analysis, which is very, very interesting. And that also kind of his work has been very much about temporality, but also spatiality and the differences between that. So that's a very, very
well, there's certainly
I'll definitely look that up.
You know, and as cultures define them, they create a whole new reality. So the other thing I wondered is if you use focus groups in your research.
No, not yet. That might be something I would like to do at a later point. Basically, because I know that there's a lot of issues around this topic, which is controversial, of course, with regards to whales, with regards to how people engage with government, and how people engage with experiments with ropeless gear, and etc., etc. All of these controversies, you know, I'd like to gain more trust and to be more sure about how to raise those kind of issues in a focus group context, because I don't think at this point I doubt that I would actually get a lot of well, I had to think very carefully about how I put together those focus groups in order to get some of the information.
I've used it a lot in my own work, and I found it absolutely fascinating. But I'm working more with younger people, and you know, I thought what you said about the cultural impact or sort of angst generated by the discussion of ropeless gear was really fascinating. And in my own conversations with fishermen, it certainly struck a nerve that I wasn't understanding as well as I think I do a little better now. So I thank you for that. Okay. But anyhow, I've enjoyed this enormously as an aging anthropologist myself, or aged, I guess is really more accurate. It's wonderful to hear what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you a lot. Yeah, I think I mean ropes is ropes in particular I think is absolutely fascinating. And also, of course, also traps. There are, I mean, when I started to look into traps, I was kind of thinking about it mainly as a fishing technology, and of course, there's so much more to them than that. And so I think also partly that is why a lot of the controversy around it is because it means something so much more to fishermen that actually it's just a technology that they use.
Well, change, cultivation studies are fascinating, and change is so difficult, and the people introducing the change sometimes do it in a way that offends everybody, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. So we are a bit over time, so we'll do just a brief run through the questions and in the Q&A. Anne Berlin asked, do you plan on publishing any of your research from Stonington in the near future? Yeah, of course I will. That's part of the plan to publish some academic articles, might be a book eventually. We are actually planning on writing a book together, the three of us on the SEATIMES project. So that will be a kind of a comparison there. So that will come. Of course, in the near future, that is a bit relative what do you actually mean by that, because in the publishing world, things take an incredibly long time. So let's see how fast that will, how near that future actually will be. But I'll start writing a bit on what I've done so far, and a lot of it will be I need to follow up on studies and haven't come back. But if you follow that website that's on last part of the list there, you will probably get some updates on the publishing coming out of this. Yeah, Connor Buckley, what observations have you made regarding the adaptability of these multi-species relationships to changes in phenology or other temporal dynamics? Are there ways in which these relationships can be more or less fragile when faced with changes in the environment? Yeah, that's a huge question, of course, and something that I've been interested in following up on the what's going on basically in the relations between young lobsters and the plankton, the zooplankton called Calanus fimarchicus, which is the Calanus is a zooplankton that is very, very, very important for marine life. Some marine biologists would say that it is the most important living being on the planet, because it's a food source for so many different kinds of beings, and lobster being one of them. Another being whales, right whales, for instance. So there's like this interconnection there between lobsters and white whales, and that is not that often talked about. But the thing is that there are, with global warming or the warming of the waters, and particularly the waters of the Gulf of Maine, the places where you find Calanus fimarchicus and changes a bit, and also the time when of the year when the Calanus is in the same water column as the young lobsters, lobster larvae, etc. So what they're seeing is that they're actually the very, very important kind of synchronicity between the kind of blooming of the zooplankton Calanus and the egging of the lobsters and the lobster larvae. There's actually what is called a phenological mismatch going on there, and that might have something to do with the fact that the lobster population is on its way down a bit. So I'm not a marine biologist. I'm not like an authority on this stuff. I'm interested in talking to people who knows a lot more about this stuff than I do, and so that those processes are a thing that I would be very, very interested in, and that is also part of the thing that some of these things are kind of invisible in a way and difficult to kind of actually see, and it requires different kinds of science to see it, and some of it is not that kind of visibilized in the public discourse as well. So that's also something I find very interesting. Deborah, what caused you to become interested in the interaction between humans and other species? Do you have any difficulty getting trust of members of the community in which you are interested? And another question, have you had time to look at the relationship between the fishing community and the art community, for instance, and clam population and bird life? So basically what Deborah asked is, to what extent have I been interested in looking at all the different kinds of communities, I guess, that are part of the Royal community? And that is also, I didn't mention that in the talk, but that's also why I find it very, very interesting to be at a specific place, doing research in Stonington, for instance, and not about doing research about lobster fishing in Maine in general. So my research has been focused on being here and trying to learn as much as possible about Deer Isle and Stonington and the community here, and not kind of running around to all these other different fishing communities around Maine. I have been around a bit, but focused on here because I wanted to understand a bit how also the fishing community and the relations between humans and marine life also kind of unfold in other ways and just only within the lobster fishery. And of course, Deer Isle is a very, very fascinating place in terms of all the other challenges it's dealing with regards to affordable housing, the kind of distinction between people in kind of local and summer people and people from away, which is also another way in which kind of temporality and temporality distinctions actually register in this community between different forms of people coming at different times of the year, for instance. So that is a very, very fascinating thing to observe. And of course, the art community, which I've not done particular research on that, but I've kind of got to know people within that community, and there's this obvious kind of, it seems from outside that it is the fishing community and art community are there's not that much interaction going on, but there are some, and it's interesting to see how that actually plays out. But it's something I would like to follow up on, and Deborah, if you can inform me more about that, I will be happy to do that when we meet later. Yeah, okay, yeah, some other questions. The one about how I become interested in the interactions between humans and other species is basically that's the story from the Philippines, because I went to the Philippines in order to study the social life of the people there, but pretty soon realized that in order to understand anything of that, I needed to include other actors in that community than only humans, be it animals, be it plants. I haven't talked that much about that, but that's also part of it. And also spirits, which to them were other kinds of actors that are very, very important. So I was kind of drawn into that whole understanding of a much more kind of ecological understanding of community, and that's also why I kind of found a home in what is called multispecies anthropology, which is not only sociality is not only about what's going on between people, but also what's going on between people, but also between people and animals and plants and materials and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. I think that's all the questions. And thank you very much for attending. As I said, please feel free to get in touch or over email, or if you see me, just stop me. Yeah, very happy to have this discussion with all of you, and have a good weekend, I guess. Thank you.